Hey everybody, Pete A. Turner coming at you here, asking you to check out my technology podcast called Popping the Bubble. There's no E on the end of bubble, B-U-B-B-L. Sandra Ponce de Leon and I, we get in and we demystify what's going on in the Silicon Valley. You want to know where we're headed? Come check us out.
This is Mick Gillette.
This is Jay Moore.
This is Greg Proops.
This is Gabby Reese.
This is Nate Boyer.
This is Hilliard Guest.
This is Nathan
This
East.
is Rob Bell.
This is J.R. Robinson.
This is Dan Stone.
This is Dr. Bob Greenberg.
Hey, this is John Leon Guerrero.
Hey, I'm Mark Valley.
Hey, and this is Pete A. Turner.
My name is Stephen Running. I'm a Regents professor at the University of Montana. Just recently retired 3 months ago to emeritus status. My specialty is Earth system science and climate change and working with NASA on Earth observation satellites. Oh, and you're listening to the Break It Down Show.
And now, the Break It Down Show with John Leon Guerrero, Mark Valley, and Pete A. Turner.
This is Pete. I'm a solo here in Missoula, Montana, sitting at the Edgewater restaurant as part of the Doubletree in gorgeous Missoula, Montana. If you guys have never been to Montana, you should come because it is stunning here, even in the early winter. And I'm fortunate to have Dr. Steve Running here with me. You heard him in his intro. This guy has a lot of knowledge about climate change. He's working with NASA to look at things like the amount of capacity we have to create agriculture and developing how we look at the biosphere as a whole, right? I mean, as a big piece. So University of Montana, retired, but still back in a more of a research mode. Okay. And then you've got your work with NASA that you do. That's incredible. And I just thank you for coming on. Thanks for sitting with me and suggesting this wonderful place. It's fantastic. First question for you is, what the heck do you do?
Well, I'll give a brief bio, a mercifully brief bio. I started in graduate school as a plant physiologist. So my training is really down and dirty at the leaf level, how do plants photosynthesize and grow. What turned out to be a fabulous turn of events in about 1981, Ronald Reagan started pushing NASA to go after the big questions. At the time, they were doing relatively pedestrian things like trying to figure out the Russian wheat crop. And Ronald Reagan said, I want NASA to do big stuff. And so this is right as the Mauna Loa CO2 record of Dave Keeling's was just getting long enough that it was real clear that CO2 was going up. And the very nascent science inquiry of, we should be studying the whole world, was just starting to bubble up. And so I stumbled along at the perfect time. Can you believe I owe Ronald Reagan my career in this kind of roundabout way?
Well, you weren't going to be an air traffic controller, that's for sure.
That's right. We remember that. So NASA called a number of ecologists. What I did have at the time was computer modeling expertise, which almost no biologist had. Any computer modeling. That back then campuses had like a single mainframe for the entire campus, and it was always in the engineering school. And so that was, you might say, my skill ticket to get in the door.
But how did you even get that skill ticket? Because that far back, you're talking punch cards and 1-inch tape and all these archaic things. How does a guy who's looking at plants and photosynthesis, how do you get that?
I had a very forward-thinking advisor at Oregon State, Richard Waring, and he, even though he never learned to program himself, he could see that was the future of systems ecology, which was really the field I was working in. So he, even as an undergraduate, he pushed me to go over and take Fortran programming classes and things like that. And so I still remember my first program was written in Dynamo 2, which is the language that the Limits to Growth book was programmed for. And it was 23 lines of code long, and it took something like an hour to process.
Wow.
But at any rate, so NASA came around to some ecologists and said, we want you to brainstorm. How could we study the whole Earth? It's never been done. We have to remember, back then there really weren't even any satellites. We're just getting started.
Right. Yeah.
And so when you talk 1981, you're really not only before the computer era, but you're before the global satellite era also, or just right at the front edge of those two capabilities.
And we're on just the very beginning of the space shuttle era as well, where you can start to actually have a plan to have something happen miles up in the atmosphere to observe or start to create these experiments. Yes, there was a Skylab and those kind of things, but really to have a sustainable approach to these things, that takes some real visionary type things. How much of that vision belonged to you?
Well, I think our small committees at the time, the one particular document that I wrote part of was called Land-Related Global Habitability Science Issues. Published at NASA headquarters in 1983.
Wow.
And it simply was the kind of brainstorming that I think all scientists wish they could do.
Right.
Basically, no holds barred. NASA wanted to get some ideas. How could we measure the entire planet in a meaningful way for the whole Earth system? And of course, when I say the Earth system, I'm referring to the atmosphere, the ocean, the cryosphere, snow and ice, and then the biosphere. Those are the four fundamental components that we always think about. And so there in the early 80s, my part was the biosphere. It was just trying to think through how could we ever measure anything about the whole world in a meaningful way.
Yeah.
This was really when the science community was just starting to look at Dave Keeling's Mauna Loa CO2 curve.
Right, okay.
Which started in 1967.
Okay.
But it took 10, 15 years to see the kind of pattern that was developing. Just a continuous increase in atmospheric CO2. So this was the time when NASA decided that figuring out how to study the Earth system was really the kind of big question that would help us understand potential climate change, which back then we thought it was still potential.
Yeah.
And so that hatched what became the Earth Observing System, and which is in orbit to this day. It was in 1989 that NASA petitioned to Congress to start this, as they called it then, Mission to Planet Earth, and then designated a number of these satellites. I was proposed and selected to one of the satellite science teams, and we started building these satellites to measure the Earth system. And these are going to this day. A couple of these satellites the taxpayers should be proud of us. They're still going 20 years later. And of course, now we see in the news this incredible monitoring of the planet that would have never happened without this mission to Planet Earth of NASA's.
As NASA tries to figure these things out, do they have natural scientists, people that you are peers that you can talk to, or are you really tasked with saying, when you put the satellite up, could you put a infrared camera or whatever it's going to be on it?
Nowadays, there's lots of natural scientists paying attention to NASA, but I'd have to say in 1981, there were only a few of us.
Okay.
NASA was mostly aerospace engineers, and so it had very little Earth science capability in itself. Really, in outside academia, nobody worked at the global scale.
Right.
And so this really was a scale of science that had never been tried before. Combination of the satellites and the computers are the two factors that over the last 30 years has allowed this to develop to the way it now has.
So the question I'm trying to figure out is how does NASA get over this hurdle of getting there? Like, is this grant money, and do they go on the internet? Listen to me back in '83. Do they go out into the yellow pages and go, I need, let's see, a natural scientist that knows Fortran? How do they get from Ronald Reagan's charter
Right.
to paying you.
Well, and of course, it's very much different now than it was then. Back then, they really did identify a handful of leading ecologists of the time and invited them to some of these think tanks where we started this sort of development of strategy of measuring the Earth system. Nowadays, all NASA has to do, and this is true of all the science agencies, is they put out a call for proposals.
Right.
And it's an open call to anybody in the country, actually anybody in the world in some cases, but certainly anybody in the country at any institution. It's really an open competition for the best ideas. And NASA will have some stated objectives that we want to improve our measurement of the ozone hole over the South Pole.
Sure.
And so they'll have some sort of statement of the kind of science that they're interested in, and then it's just open for anybody to propose. And this is the common way of funding the science now. Now, particularly when you're building a new satellite, it's of course more complicated and takes longer. Our particular satellite that I work with, called MODIS, the Moderate Resolution Imaging Spectroradiometer. You'll see why we don't say that too often.
Yeah.
We started conceptualizing that sensor in about 1984.
Wow.
We got the New Start authorization, as they call it, from NASA in, I think, 1990.
Wow.
The first version of the satellite was launched in December of 1999. So it was 15 years
Right.
from the initial ideas of the kind of measurements needed and the kind of sensor that would be required, and talking with the engineers of the time of how to build certain components to get the job done. It took 15 years.
Yeah.
And of course, now it's still in the air. So that launch in December 99, we're still getting data right today.
It's doing the work. You're going to realize what you didn't know in 84 when you start.
Right.
So did you get what you wanted, or was it like, man, I wish we would have put, whatever, a heat lamp on it or something, to...
There's always the case where some of the core ideas and technologies that are pretty obvious are put on the satellite, and then there's and the satellite is launched, and of course these things cost hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars, and so and take many years to build. So this whole endeavor is long and to some extent slow and quite expensive, especially for the first version of a new sensor. That's never been done. You're literally inventing a new measurement capability for the Earth. And so those do take a long time. And what's always interesting is once the satellite gets up there, new things are discovered that weren't ever planned for.
Right.
Probably the best example that I think our listeners would be familiar with. You've seen those global night lights images of the Earth that show all the lights on the dark Earth. That was never planned for in the original satellites. When a satellite goes around the Earth, of course, half the day it's on the sunny side. Yeah. The other half of the orbit's in the dark.
Right.
And so we, especially back when we were so computer limited for processing, you just didn't process the night data. And so every time that dark half of the orbit was by, then you just didn't process it.
Wow.
One guy got curious one time, and this has been a good number of years ago now, probably. I can't remember exactly, but probably in the late 90s. He just thought, I'm going to take a look at one of the night passes and just take a look and see if I can see anything. And of course, what he saw were all these patterns of night lights. You can literally see freeways because of the string of headlights across the country and across the world. It turns out those are now some of the most popular NASA data sets of all. And yet that was never planned originally.
Right. Yeah, these are the things that are great about science. Just by getting in and screwing stuff up, you find things that are just incredible, even if it's an aesthetic or it's just a data. Like, look at this data. Is this going to change how we look? It does change how we look at things. Yeah, absolutely. So I want to fast forward a little bit because there's so many interesting things going on now. I do want to mention really quick, because I don't think we mentioned it in the early part of the bio. In 2007, you were part of a team, and along with Al Gore, you guys won the Nobel Peace Prize.
Right.
Holy shit.
Yeah.
By the way, Dr. Running is also part of a team that won the Nobel Peace Prize.
Yep.
And that is fantastic for your work with all of the atmospheric stuff. What was, if you can boil it down in a abstract, what did you guys figure out?
Well, this was the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change,
Right?
The IPCC, which was chartered back in, I think I should remember the history better, late 1980s or early 90s. And they were tasked by the United Nations with doing a summary of climate change science every 6 years. And this was an international activity. We had, I think, authors from 130 countries on the team that wrote the 2007 report. This was the fourth version of these reports. And, of course, we didn't have the slightest idea we were being considered. It was absolutely, the kind of bolt out of the lightning bolt out of the sky. The morning that was announced, there was no gossip beforehand that we were even on any kind of list. It never even occurred to us that we would be in something like that.
So wait, is this one of those moments, because I love these moments, when the phone rings and you're like, quit fucking around, Larry, and you hang up on him, basically, because you're like, I didn't even know we were being considered.
You know what? It was exactly that.
Yes!
I had one of my best friends that, of course, knew I was on this committee, and I'd talked to him about what we did in these big reports we were writing for like 3 years. And so he had known I was on this committee. And he called up at 6 a.m. because he gets up earlier than me just for the hell of it, I guess. And he says, Steve, you just won the Nobel Prize. And exactly as you say, quit following me. He says, get on the internet right now. Take a look. The IPCC just won the Nobel Peace Prize with Al Gore. And you're still just, and of course, you rush into your computer, and by God, the thing with the Nobel Peace Prize, the minute it's announced, it is world headlines.
Yeah.
I don't think there's any other prize on earth that gets the notoriety every single year that they break into newscasts to announce the Nobel Peace Prize. I mean, that's bigger than Oscars.
It's bigger than Oscars.
I mean, it took me a while for that to sink in. So yeah, it started exactly the way the movies show it, and I've never forgot that.
I love it.
And then, of course, the whole day at work was nothing normal one bit. All it was emails and phones ringing.
Yeah, can you even get any work done that day?
I realized pretty quick, I don't want to get any work done.
Right.
I won't have another moment like this in my career.
Good for you.
And of course, this was shared with 600 authors. So in a way, and in fact, the climate deniers love to beat up on us that you're not real Nobel laureates. It was the committee. Yeah. And I got a good bit of hate mail over the years of reminding me that.
Yeah, and when I was researching for the show, I saw that stuff and purposely didn't bring it up because, honestly, fuck those guys. You did work that was, it's got your committee's name on it. I don't care if it's 1,000 dudes. It doesn't matter to me. Yeah. Your work garners the attention.
Yeah.
You get to say you won the Nobel Peace. I don't know how you don't get to say that, so forget those guys.
And I've got a very nice certificate with my name on it and Nobel Peace Prize 2007. So I've got good documentation too.
Yeah. and so with regards to that award, even the other Nobel Prizes are just not as known. Like we might know that these people have won the Peace Prize, but the one for economics, I defy anybody to name 2 people that have done it. So it really is the cream on top of the cream, like the foam on top of that. There is no bigger thing that you can get. There may be something in science or math that is a notable career thing, but no one else knows about it.
Right. Right.
It's just for you and your peers to go,
Yeah.
I won the Wesley Award.
Oh, yeah.
Or whatever,
There's fancy awards in math,
Yeah, right.
for example. That
Yeah. So this is fantastic and great job on doing that because, wow, that's the pinnacle. I wanted to ask you about our ability now to put satellites up. We literally can, in months now, commission satellites through private companies like Spire as a friend of the show. They put up CubeSats.
Yeah.
We talked about this a little bit before we started recording. And these guys can literally take a commission from somebody and for pennies on the dollar,
Yeah.
like for $1 million, build and huck it up there. And
Yep.
it literally goes up as ballast. And now here's a job that they invented. The space broker for space. You're the space broker. It's like, oh yeah, there's launches. I'm a launch coordinator. All these different things are happening.
Yeah.
This one's got 500 pounds of ballast. Yeah, we'd love to sell this space.
Yep.
And then when you get up there, here's how their stuff goes out. Like, yeah, it goes out with the trash. Just open the door and poop it out with the McDonald's bags. And then it's in low Earth orbit. So it's out there for maybe 18 months, 3 years-ish. And then it comes in and burns up. And then they throw another one. So you can literally go, here's the thing I want. And one of the things that Spire does is they sell and they didn't know all this was going to happen. But NOLA now buys private data from these guys. They can tell you where any airplane is in the sky, any ship on the sea is now trackable.
Yeah.
They use a thing called, and I'm going to get way out of my depth, radio occultation. Yep. And they look at weather, and this is where I'm going with this, as they look at the biosphere, the things that I guess what's going on between the two satellites in low Earth orbit is talking about what is in the atmosphere. And what they figured out is they can do almost like a 3-dimensional whole Earth biospheric CAT scan.
Yep.
Which allows them to look at like hurricane effects over here in Jakarta, which,
Yep.
it becomes this big system. That has to make you just over the moon with all the data you get to play with.
Yeah. It really is. We've completely flipped from when I started in 1980, where we had no global data on just about anything. And now we have just avalanches of global data every day. And so we've kind of flipped the problem from all theory and no data to lots of data and hopefully some theory too. A good bit of theory, of course. Yeah, it's an interesting observation to think that my sensor Modus took 15 years to design and build and launch. And now in this era of these there's various names for numbers of these CubeSats and microsats, and some of them are like the size of a softball.
Yeah, tiny. Yeah.
And they can launch like 50 of them at a time. And what that has done is really solved one of our biggest problems of Earth observation with our original old satellites. You had an orbit. We call it the polar orbit because it basically goes over the North Pole to the South Pole like this.
Yeah.
And then the Earth turns underneath it.
Right.
Now, an orbit is about an hour and a half long. And so this satellite will make, I think it's 18 orbits per day as the Earth turns. And you're getting these swaths of raw data that you then, with your computer processing, knit together into a solid image. Well, the point that the satellite goes over Missoula, Montana, right overhead, with these satellites, it may be 2 weeks before it comes back straight overhead again.
Right.
And so anything that happens in those 2 weeks, you just miss.
Right.
And even beyond that, you have a single orbital timing so that our satellite would go over at 10:30 in the morning.
Right.
Well, if you wanted to know what happened in the middle of the afternoon, you were just out of luck because the satellite only can fit this orbit. In today's new world, where you can launch 100 satellites, you can have them going in these constellations all at all sorts of times and orbital paths.
Yeah.
And what we've now broken through in probably just the last 5 years is with these cheap, fast little sensors, we can be looking at any place on Earth virtually any time of the day.
Right.
And so you can, by calling up the current satellite that's right over where you want to look at, you can get immediate imagery in a way that was impossible 20 years ago.
I would imagine that now that you have the access to the 24/7 data, on demand, but you also now said, what about these other sensors? Because you don't have to just think, what's the one sensor?
Right.
Let's throw up all these things. And within 5 years, not only could you have done all of that research, it's complete. The satellite's already back to Earth, and you're on to the next project. It's incredible when you think about what we're going to be able to do. What are we learning, though? I mean, we have these questions, and I'm not trying to get into like, there's no global warming or whatever. And at one point we thought it was going to be an ice age soon. I get that. We try to figure these things out, and we got to make a lot of mistakes along the way. But what's the data telling us? And then let me ask you the bigger question. If there's going to be 8 billion people on the planet, at some point we got to say enough's enough, don't we?
Well, and of course, these are the kind of questions that get right into the kind of science I do. And that is studying the biosphere, studying what we call the global carbon cycle.
Sure.
And carbon is, of course, a component of living biomass. It's also the CO2 molecule that's the greenhouse gas that has the climate significance. And so
I wanted to take a second out of the show and talk to you guys about our sponsor, WeFixYourScript.com. What I love about these guys is they're encouraging you, just like John, Mark, and I, to create something. If you think screenwriting is your thing, or if you've got a script that you're kind of stuck on, this is what you do. You don't got to buy anything. Just give these guys a call. Schedule a 15-minute consultation for free. It's WeFixYourScript.com. I highly encourage you guys to support these guys. Reach out to us. Reach out to them. Reach out to WeFixYourScript.com.
in earth science, the global carbon cycle is a whole study domain of its own. Mm-hmm. And my part of that is trying to understand how much CO2 does plant life absorb through photosynthesis, but on a global scale. And so that really is the data set that I generate is a daily measure of global photosynthesis. And that has both the climate, the theoretical, you might say climate relevant feature of helping us understand as humanity puts CO2 into the atmosphere burning fossil fuels. We now know that the biosphere is absorbing about 30% of that, and of that CO2 that's absorbed back into plant growth. And then the oceans are absorbing about 26%, and then the remainder stays in the atmosphere, and that's why the Mauna Loa curve is going up. And so we now know we couldn't partition that 30 years ago. We had no idea where it went. We knew the Mauna Loa curve and nothing else. And so this is an example of what we now can understand pretty accurately of the role of the biosphere and the oceans in balancing this carbon cycle, because that then tells us a lot of how fast the Earth's going to warm up by how much CO2 is building up in the atmosphere. But it also brings up, you might say, policy questions of could we enhance forest growth worldwide to help absorb more CO2? Right. Or if we keep having wildfires burning like crazy, are we accelerating global warming? And so by understanding what the role of the biosphere is in the carbon cycle and climate, we can ask questions like this that have real policy relevance. And of course, the other, you might say, more immediate practical sense is when you're studying global plant growth, you're totally studying how much can we feed the future world. We're feeding 7 billion now. We expect 9 billion by 2050. Can we feed all of them? Yeah. And so you get right exactly in the middle of these sort of large, big global scale policy questions. It is kind of ironic that when you do global scale science, nobody actually manages the whole world. And so all of this is kind of esoteric policy theory, you might call it, that it's awful hard to translate into tangible policy action. Yeah. And this is something that we struggle with.
And then also there's cross-policy. There has to be cross-policy argument, because Department of Forestry has a plan, and they have to balance conservation and preservation and all these things. My uncle worked for the forestry department. He lives locally here, and he was talking about old growth forests. Like, yes, they're important, but when they burn and they kill a 3,000-year-old redwood tree, I can't replace that thing.
Yep.
You have to balance these things. So
Yeah.
you have we need wood.
Mm-hmm.
We need artichokes. We need all these things.
Yeah.
And that means it's very tough. I got to imagine that to get all of these things, you guys to all agree and like, this is the direction we want to go. And then it's like, now we got to get different governments to all chip in, because China's got a lot of people.
Yep.
And if they don't play, it's like, you guys have to play,
Yeah.
or we have to play, or India, or all these other. So
see, and this is where, as scientists, we're in, I think you could say, a bit of an awkward position. And this was particularly with the IPCC committee. Mm-hmm. Our job was to summarize the science, but was not to in any way recommend policy choices. Mm-hmm. We basically say, here's how the system's working. Here's the array of possible policies that could change trajectories, but it's not our job to choose which one is the best. And this is something where scientists are increasingly having an awkward time of being purely scientific and being asked to make advocating stances on certain policies. And I'm finding myself that I can't just stay at arm's length from the policy choices. There's certain things that I see that are very clearly correct policy for where the Earth needs to go. I can't just keep arm's length with my science theory.
Yeah. Can you talk about any of that at all?
Probably the single one that is most obvious to anybody that studies the global carbon cycle is the world's got to quit burning coal.
Right.
Everywhere.
Right.
Yeah, America for sure, China next, India next, everywhere. Coal is an environmental disaster pollution-wise, and it's also a global warming disaster. It's the most carbon-intensive energy you can get, and so it's just accelerating warming the most of anything we could possibly do.
Okay, so let me ask you the fair science question then, and I'm not a scientist, but as a layman. Thermodynamics, there's laws, there's rules, right?
Yeah.
And so we have to burn something to replace coal. Are we just reducing that number that's already past what we're able to process?
No, we don't have to burn things.
Okay.
See, that's
nice.
There is the first step
of
rethinking this. You can generate energy without burning things, and of course, what we're now watching, the transition from piston engine cars that burn gas to move to electric cars. And for example, if you get that electricity from the solar panels on your roof, which my new electric car, I charge not today so much, but on most days I charge directly from solar panel energy. And that then drives an electric motor to drive the car. I'm not burning anything anywhere along the way. And so this is where we have to rethink energy at a very fundamental level.
The net return, because to get that car, you still have to spend carbon somewhere, right? So you've got to put big trucks into a mine to extract lithium.
To construct any of these materials, the construction of everything, buildings and vehicles.
Yeah, and I'm not making an argument against global climate change. What I'm saying is that there's a cost. You have to tear down a mountain.
Yep.
That takes carbon-based energy of some kind, and then you have batteries that have a life, and you have to deal with those things.
You have to go dig up lithium somewhere and process it.
What's the net return on? I mean, if you have an idea, what's the net gain on having a Tesla, not a sponsor, a Tesla over the course of the next 40 years as a car versus just having a low-weight, high-mileage, small engine?
Well, this to me is where some of the most interesting science is now.
Right.
I'd have to say in the large-scale global Earth system climate science, we've pretty much figured out and measured most of the key dynamics that society needs to know. To me, by far the more interesting questions nowadays are these sort of questions. Okay, it seems clear that we want to reduce our carbon footprint, as people often say. And so, let's use an example that backfired. Corn ethanol.
Oh, sure.
Initially, corn ethanol seemed like a great idea. Geez, it's plant biomass from the sun. And this sounds good. Well, it didn't take too many years of the scientists measuring every step along the way and saying, well, you know what? You put as much energy into producing, harvesting, processing that ethanol, then you get back out at the end. You're basically going chasing your tail, and not gaining anything. And I think we're going to continue to see these sort of issues where an idea seems like a good idea, and it needs to be really analyzed step by step by step. And that's hard science to do. There's not a big, long history of it. But I think that's where some of the most interesting questions are. Does an electric car really pan out to be better than a gas engine? Now, I think, and this is not my direct field where I can quote numbers to you, but I think it's been illustrated pretty well that if the electricity is coming from a renewable source, then over the lifetime of that car, the electric car is way ahead of a gas car that is then burning gas through its whole life. Kind of the basis is building the two cars initially is pretty close to a toss-up.
Okay.
And so it's really the fuel that's used through the life of the car. Now, what the even more advanced argument would be is, well, let's quit driving cars individually to begin with. Let's get past this idea where we all have to jump in our car and drive to work every day, and let's do ride sharing. Or let's see if we can come up with public transport that people are willing to use.
Yeah.
Or, of course, my favorite, I have to admit, I've been a bike commuter my whole life. I find these new electric bikes to be just slick as hell.
Yeah, they're cool.
And of course, they're not going to be for everybody in every commuting situation. I can't imagine being out on my e-bike on an LA freeway, for example.
Yeah.
But you look here, I only have a 3-mile commute through a town like this, and an e-bike here for a commuting vehicle for 9 months of the year would be a fabulous commuting vehicle. And so you see that what I'm seeing are the most interesting questions to me are getting past the climate argument and going right away to, okay, what are our options for having a less carbon-intensive future? And whether it's transportation, whether it's building construction, concrete produces lots of CO2 in processing cement.
Right.
And so one of the new things they're looking at, I look at some of these old beams and things, is going back to engineered wood products for more structural building. And so then there's the back and forth on how much you gain by using wood instead of concrete. And I think you can just walk your way through all sorts of things through our daily lives, and you find these questions of what options do we have to do better, to have a less carbon-intensive future than the past.
I read an article one time where they proposed basically like a greenhouse and taking the exhaust from these plants and running it through a fan.
Yep.
And that fan would kick out enough kilowatts to power a community, of a small one. But you could have 10 of them in an area like Missoula potentially and have these plants that you produce that you could harvest and everything else, and they create energy. Are these things that we'll see? I mean, since we're terrified of nuclear energy, we have to do something else.
Yeah. There's some very interesting designs. The example you give where you start with particularly biomass, like around here it'd be a pro-wood residue from wild restoration on wildfires and our beetle-killed forests. We have billions of dead trees around Montana.
Right.
Start by burning the biomass. You can generate electric power directly from that to some level. You then have waste heat that's below the threshold where it can turn a steam turbine. Well, you can use that waste heat to heat a greenhouse, especially on a day like today.
Sure.
You then can take the CO2 exhaust, if it's been burned completely, and pump CO2 in the greenhouse, and the plants grow faster.
Yeah.
And so there's some very clever systems where you can have quite close to carbon neutral energy production facility. And in a way, it brings us back to systems ecology concepts where you're just never going to have a single input generate a single output at high efficiency.
Right.
What ecosystems always have had is you have your energy inputs that are then filtered through a number of different subcomponents, as you'd say, plants and the animals and all different types of plants and the soil carbon and the entire complexity of that carbon cycle is not just a single point the way we've done with our current energy systems. The problem right now is that natural gas is so cheap that it just, from a price point of view, just outcompetes everything. And so there's lots of clever ideas, but they're at a price point that isn't viable at the moment.
I mean, when you look at the potential energy in bunker oil, is it power a giant region with a fairly small amount of stuff.
Yeah.
The more CO2 in the atmosphere, but it's a tough barrier to get over. I mean, we keep finding more oil. We keep finding more ways to get oil. We're going to keep doing these things. And petrochemicals are awesome with potential energy. There's so much in it.
The plastics.
It's incredible. And we're going to have to always deal with this because someone's going to say, well, we'll pull it out of the ground.
Yeah.
We'll burn it. And then how do you take the existing non-ecosystem? How do you take the existing financial system? I'm not trying to get into a medical debate, but our access to medical care, our medical care system in the U.S. is partly stuck because a lot of people make a lot of money with the current system.
Yep.
And so you don't just go chop change because that would cause a lot of damage to that system.
Yeah.
And I think this eco stuff is the same way where you have a lot of Shell is an energy company. That's kind of how they're rebranding themselves. They want to find other ways to create and sell energy.
Yeah.
But they make a lot of money with the old way.
Yeah.
So how do we get past these things? Look, you can have a president that's either for or against that stuff, but there's still a lot of influence and lives that depend on this current system.
Yeah. And these are global systems that are changing, and they are going to change slowly. I think what we try to do in science, in at least my corner of global carbon science, is to get some priorities of first steps, second steps, third steps. And this is where we come that the first step is really to quit burning coal because it's the dirtiest and the most carbon intensive of the energy sources. Mm-hmm. We can then also be measuring how we use our current fossil fuels. Just to give you another example, gasoline really is a miracle energy.
Yes.
The energy density of a gallon of gasoline is something like 50 times higher than the energy density of a lithium battery of the same size.
Right.
50 times higher.
That's crazy.
And so gasoline is, in a way, a miracle liquid. But your car you can double the gas mileage of your car by taking that gallon of gasoline, running a generator turbine to charge a battery, and then having that battery run an electric car. Mm-hmm. Then you do taking the same gallon of gasoline and putting it through a piston engine to run all these transmissions and gears and all the mechanics.
There's a lot of drag.
There's a lot of drag. There's a lot of wasted heat.
Sure. Yeah,
and so there's so many different ways that we can parse out different options for reducing our carbon intensity. And then as we go, the emerging technologies are going to help us solve this. I look at wind and solar from 10 years ago till now.
Yeah.
Right now, if you're going to build a new electric power generating plant, most places I think I can say that most places on Earth, it's actually cheaper over the lifetime of to put up a wind turbine than to build a coal plant. And cheaper and straight out dollars and cents. And so in a way, in this particular administration that's trying to resurrect coal, the financial industry's already voted.
Yeah.
And they've voted against coal. They may slow the demise slightly, but the jury's already in on that one. And I think step by step, we're going to continue to, as we get better options, and as this steps forward in national priority, there's no doubt that if nobody cares about this, then we won't make much forward progress.
Well, and this is, I think, part of the big social problem is that we all don't evolve and think at the same pace, same way.
Yep.
And so we've got to allow people time to get comfortable with something else that's different. And we have to go at the pace of the policy that it can evolve.
Right.
It just has to be that way. And there's going to be death throes like, let's go back to coal. Like, okay, but we all know the numbers. And the guys that lend the money, they know the numbers. They have the tables. And they're like, why don't you just, not because I'm a Democrat or Republican, but because I want my money back.
Yeah.
Why don't you build a wind farm?
Yep.
You know?
Yep.
Yeah, it's incredible where we're going.
Yeah. And of course, you can't blame. I give lots of public talks, so I think about this too much, I'm afraid. You can't blame those industries for trying to protect themselves.
Yeah.
And certainly the workers to trying to just protect their livelihoods. And of course, around Montana here, the big thing is the coal strip coal mine out in eastern Montana, which I've publicly stated dozens of times, the sooner we close it down, the better.
Right.
And yet I know that there's a couple hundred mine workers out there that would leave without a job. Now, what I try to say is, I'm trying to give you all an advance notice that you've got skills, you've got skill sets that would be viable in other industries, and you probably ought to start looking sooner rather than later. You don't want to be the last one laid off at the coal mine, because that means everybody else ahead of you has already made the transition to more viable industries. But it's something that it's a transition from that type of energy production, which of course goes back to England in the 1850s, for God's sake. It's about time we find something better. And it just means that society needs to transition into this next generation of energy. And because energy pervades everything we do all day long, the minute you start into this, the ripple effects through every single minute of the day, and everything you consume, and every way you get somewhere, and everything about what we do are then impacted by what you end up choosing.
Yeah, there's no doubt. There's petrochemicals. This recorder is made out of plastic.
That's right. We all have plastic things that are very functional. We wouldn't want to try to substitute. Right. But we better find a better way to recycle that plastic.
Do you think, is there some kind of League of Nations, UN, for I know we have the UN, and the UN's done I'm going to say at a very high policy level, a good job of stabilizing global conflict. Yes, there's still fights, but Europe was always in a fight all the time throughout all of history until we started to figure these things out. And it was hard, and we're still figuring it. But is there going to come a time where we say we need, as a planet, to have somebody be the boss of how we do these things and create influence? Is that possible?
I think you've hit on what to me is one of the most intractable parts of global change in our world. It's not the technologies. We have technologies already bubbling up to help. It's global governance. And I can't tell you how many times after a public talk I've had people come up to me and quite sincerely and say something to the effect of, I'll be damned if I'm going to let some weasel from Belgium or something tell me what to do.
Yeah.
The idea that the United States would take orders from somebody else to many people is an absolute non-starter. And yet, as we're reaching planetary capacity, let's say, in a lot of different ways, some sort of global coordination is essential. And as you say, the UN is the best we have for now, but we have to all admit it doesn't have much teeth. There's not very much of an enforcement mechanism. And yet I think as we get to these global scale of these problems, some level of global governance that's widely acknowledged to have authority is going to have to emerge, or else we're going to all just sink each other's ships one by one.
Yeah, I mean, is this the standard thing where we know it's come? It's like, I don't eat right, I don't exercise enough. I make poor choices and my body reflects it. And I look at my body getting bigger and shittier as I get older. and yet look at my actions. You know, like I could simply just change a handful of things and my body would reflect, and that's just me. Like, oh, I'm eating cancer today. Like, here I go. Let me get some more cancer and let me put it in my mouth. So
it's funny how the psychologists talk about how many human choices are illogical.
Right.
And how one of the biggest faults of economics is the going in assumption that people will make logical choices when they're given the correct set of economic information. And yet, as your illustration just shows, that isn't true one bit.
Yeah.
We do illogical things that are detrimental to our long-term health every day. Probably the breakfast I just ate.
Yes.
I probably should have gnawed on some celery instead. Instead of that nice French toast.
Exactly. Yeah. Oh, God, that French toast. I sent a picture to my girlfriend of the lemon crepes, and I'm like, this is what I want to have. What I'm going to have are these eggs and ham, which I believe to be healthy, and then I'll find out in 2 years that you can't eat eggs and ham anymore. God.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, so global governance, the Paris Accord is a great example of, after many tries. Remember Copenhagen in 2009, they tried to come to a global agreement and then it all collapsed.
Yeah.
And that's just a year after our Nobel Peace Prize. And we thought we had all this momentum and goodwill of the world. And then Copenhagen just unraveled. Finally in Paris, we got the first basically unanimous agreement by all countries that this was an appropriate goal for humanity, the way I think of it. And, of course, everybody can argue with the details and that it's not going fast enough and a lot of countries aren't doing their share and blah, blah, blah.
Right.
The important thing is that every single country signed on that this is an appropriate long-term objective for humanity that had never been done before.
Right.
That's the first step in us, the collective global us, acknowledging that we're all in this together and we've got to come to some sort of mechanism of collectively agreeing on progress.
I like to talk about where the work is, and I like to link policy to tactics.
Yeah.
Everybody talks about, it's funny, I've noticed that people talk about tactics. They instantly start talking about strategies. Like, hold on. What is the first step? And let's understand, the first step is going to be tentative. There's no baby that started running. It's just
a good way to put it.
You wiggle and you're not sure, and everybody's like, oh, Jesus, it's not going to work. It's not going to work.
That's right. So it's going to tip over.
Yeah, there has to be some place where the work starts. And if the work starts in us all nodding our heads saying, yes, we all need to do something, then you can work on the next problem of culpability when you don't follow the plan, or how do we help Haiti?
Yeah.
And it freaks me out when I look at the satellite imagery of Haiti and the Dominican Republic. One's tan and brown and absolutely got no trees, and the other side's lush. Like, we have to figure out how to balance that. Like, those folks have to burn whatever they can get their hands on to survive. Mm-hmm. And you can't just solve that problem. You can't just flip a switch on. It takes petrochemicals to turn on in the first place. Yep. It's very complex. So you have to say, all right, how do we get, China, India, the U.S., Russia, and pick another country. We have to get these core countries to say, we're going to push this thing forward and create global policy that incents or de-incentivizes these kind of actions.
Right.
But Jesus Christ, you can't go there. You have to now back out to the tactic of what's the next thing that micro advances this whole thing.
And this is what I've felt that I can always say in a collective sense, we've got to reduce our carbon footprint.
Yeah.
But that, as you say, is a long-term strategy without a short-term tactic, and that's why I find it's valuable to target that. Stopping burning coal is the first step. Yeah. And for us, it's very clear why that should be. We can justify that every which way. We have lots of other ways to generate electric power. And so we do have choices. In some things, we don't have very many choices yet, like jet airplanes, for example.
Right.
But for generating electric power, there's no reason to keep burning coal. There's other ways that are better environmentally and climatically and
economically
right down the list. And yet, of course, you see the coal companies still battling and arguing that they're still relevant.
Clean coal.
Yeah. As a scientist, I've found that I can't just give science speak. On this type of an issue, I've got to say clearly and openly that this is what we see as the first priority, and in a way the easiest priority for society as a whole to be moving forward. And yet you're going to have resistance from people that are in that industry, and that's going to just happen step by step by step, that whoever's in the current old industry is going to resist progress. I mean, that happened when cars were invented. That happened when, you can go right down the list of every big invention, and whatever they overturned fights back until it's a losing cause.
We had, and I forget who did the work, but the guy that figured out that lead was everywhere and was poisoning us.
Yeah.
I can't remember the scientist's name. No, we can't get rid of lead paint. We can't get rid of lead in gasoline.
Yeah.
And all these fights, it's like, no, actually, we have to. We don't have a choice. Yeah. So something at some point, and hopefully it doesn't take a giant global catastrophe to do it, but at some point we have to find the impetus to make the same kind of educated, okay, we're going to slowly start to get rid of lead in all things that we consume. And we're going to slowly get rid of coal power. And if that means that we've got to take care of these coal miners and find a way to, a lot of times I lean right on things, people, but I also go, look, these guys have lives.
Yeah.
And
you can't just throw them over the over the transom.
Yeah. So as a nation, we should all have a couple of bucks to help these guys out, to translate them into a different field or whatever,
Yeah. Retraining for a different field, because they certainly have some viable skill sets.
Yeah.
If in the mining industry. And so I think this is part of what we collectively have to understand, is as we're trying to turn over old industries into newer, cleaner industries, we've got to give the people in those old industries a chance to move into the new economy. And so this is certainly part of the equation. And yet we can't not be moving forward on these, or else we're going to cook this planet, and we're going to be in big trouble in 50 years.
Yeah, Stephen Hawking talks about 600 years, but it's going to be a whole lot harder to live here in 50 if we don't start to make changes for sure. It's going to be a lot more uncomfortable.
Yeah. And the thing is, we have lots of options already to go.
Yeah.
So it isn't like we have to have some breakthrough new inventions. We just have to have the societal courage and impetus to make some of these changes that are already ready for us to go.
And if we're to get back to the middle-aged, too fat, too broken body example, this stuff doesn't get easier once you've had a heart attack or 5 years from now or whatever, or when your tendons are that much less supple and stretchy, So the time to get in is to get. What I don't want to take too much more of your time, but I do want to ask, what does someone do personally, individually? Like, what do you think? I don't control what coal I burned specifically and directly, right? I can't ride my bike to Montana, but what kind of things in general can we do? I mean, am I making a difference by having a garden and all these other things?
Yeah. Well, I think coming down to the personal level, there's a number of real easy things to do nowadays. LED light bulbs are a massive improvement over old light bulbs.
Yeah.
They're like 90% more efficient. I mean, not just a little bit more efficient, 90%. So the first thing everybody in America should do is take out every old incandescent light bulb and put in LEDs. And of course, the LEDs now are cheap. Oh my God, I can't believe how fast they've come down.
And they pay for themselves.
They pay for themselves.
In such a short amount of time.
Yeah. And so to me, that's the first no-brainer of all, is go through your house and take out all the old light bulbs and put in LEDs. I think a next step for some people, and everybody has a different daily life that they deal with, for some people, they can rethink their commute and see if there's a better way, a more efficient way, I won't even itemize everybody's heard. There's so many different options. I really like the movement to more local food production. And of course, the most local of all is having your own garden. That's the best. I can't have my own garden because our neighborhood is inundated with deer. And so they eat everything. But I can certainly buy my produce at the weekend farmers market. And there's farmers markets all over the country now. And so I think we're making steps ahead in that consciousness of eating more locally. And I think that's a big step. We talked about feeding 9 billion people a number of minutes ago.
Yeah.
And the fact is, right now, about a third of the food produced ends up being wasted and not consumed. A third.
That's crazy.
That's just nuts.
Yeah.
And so here's a place where, for relatively little pain, we can feed 2 billion more people. The planet can grow enough food to feed 2 billion more people. But we have to get way smarter in our entire food system. And so that's another place where there's endless different ways that people can make choices that can improve on food waste.
These are the big problems, right? Like if you get to 9 billion people, well, then why aren't you going to 13 billion? The number just goes. And at some point we have to say there has to be less people, at some point.
It kind of has to be self-limiting because China tried to, force a one-child family rule. That is highly unpopular politically.
Yeah.
And so these have to be choices that people voluntarily are willing to make to have less kids. And you know what they found over and over forever is the minute you educate young girls so that they can have careers of their own, they immediately have less interest in 6 or 8 kids. They've shown that dozens of times.
Yeah.
Educating young women, giving them a wider array of life choices to make is the first way to drive down.
Yeah. And the other thing I know is that Mother Nature's a bitch, and she will find a way to cook us. Even if we cook on ourselves, she's going to reap at some point.
Well, and that's something that in my part of global change science, we pay a lot of attention to. We're already at this situation in the Northern Rockies where we're having way bigger wildfires than we used to have.
Right.
We have had huge, big insect epidemics killing forests. And so I think Mother Nature is already kind of starting to crack the whip.
Sure.
Our snowpacks are melting off earlier, which means our rivers usually get thinner and thinner by the late summer. And so we're seeing natural consequences already.
Yeah.
And of course, in California, my God, the fires that you have down there now it's just about a year-round vulnerability.
It's all the time.
It's all the time. And that wasn't true 50 years ago.
And we've got billions of dead evergreens as well.
Yep.
From a variety
and
of
so
blights.
we're already seeing Mother Nature starting to flash warning signs. And this is why it's so amazing for me to hear some of these politicians just shrug off. No, I don't seem to notice anything different. And you go, what?
Yeah.
Because it's pretty easy for us in this part of the country to see things are different, and if they continue to the pace they're on, it's going to be pretty bad news in 50 years.
Yeah, well, I've had you for over an hour already, but it was fascinating, and I really appreciate you taking the time. I hope that we can, whenever you're in the area or we're in Missoula, we can do this again because, these conversations, you just keep having them, and if one person starts to slightly go, I'm going to try taking the ferry to work.
Yeah.
It's just those tiny little micro changes, those tactical steps.
Yeah. And everybody has a different lifestyle, but if they just start thinking about what are some options I have that could be my personal contribution beyond the big theoretical contribution.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, thank you again very much for coming in. We really appreciate it.
All right. Well, the sun's coming out. We better get outside.